So good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming along. I'm just going to make a very quick introduction on behalf of everyone here at Balderton Capital. So I'm a partner here at Balderton, and we're investors in software companies across Europe, but in particular in the UK. And obviously everything we do now in software is utilizing the recent advancements in machine learning and artificial intelligence. So this is obviously an issue that's very close to our heart here. And we run a huge number of events like this, and we're very excited to be partnering with Christchurch and Demos in running these things. And if you're interested in this kind of field, please do sign up to the Balderton website for our email address. But I want to say two very quick things. One is, one of the things that we are very excited about at Balderton is bringing together academics and business community along with entrepreneurs and the political community, because this, we think, is one of the biggest issues facing not just the economy today, but every aspect of it. And so we run a lot of events in this field, and we'd like you all to contribute if you can. The other thing that we're excited about is the number of British companies in particular that are being built in this area. So if you're interested in learning more about machine learning and applications of artificial intelligence from a business perspective, please do reach out to anyone at Balderton, and we can give you a bit of a rundown from what's going on. But to give you a bit of a higher level rundown, I want to hand over to Carl and Demos to chair the event this evening.
Hello. Well, James, thank you very much, and on behalf of Demos, a very warm welcome as well. A huge congratulations, I suppose, to everyone in this room for making it through like what is one of the most kind of ridiculously Arctic conditions I think I've ever seen. I think we've all done incredibly well to get here this evening. So, on behalf of Demos, a very warm welcome in this event that we're doing with Balderton Capital and Christchurch, Oxford, on I think one of the most kind of important and intractable questions which all of us swimming around in political waters and academia and in the technology world are all trying to find answers to. But before I hand over to the speakers, I just wanted to offer one brief thought about the future of AI and the nature of this question. In my mind, there's always been kind of two great deep pools of unknowingness that have surrounded the question of AI. The first is a question of the tech itself. You know, what will machines be able to do? You know, how quickly will they be able to do it? What are they actually going to get good at doing in the future? What jobs are they going to disrupt? What on earth is deep learning? When will the singularity come? When will machines start improving themselves? Will they really take over one day, and in what way, and what can we do to stop that? So there's one body of questions which I think receives a huge amount of attention and a lot of discussion around the tech and around the kind of trajectory of AI as a technical and technological endeavor. But then there is another body of questions, and one I hope that we will focus more on this evening, which is about what on earth do the rest of us actually do about AI? Questions to do with the regulations, questions to do about law and politics, questions to do with how do we actually control the way in which this incredibly new powerful force kind of begins to spread through society. How do we mitigate and even identify the problems which AI actually causes, and how do we make sure that it is a technology, much like all the other technologies which have disrupted and come through society over the years? How do we channel that for something which is actually benefiting all of us, that many more of us can be invited to, and works in the public interest and the public good? And that is a kind of tangled series of questions which have everything, I think, to do with public awareness and education, all the way through to the skills that we teach young people, the principles which kind of animate the professions that we have, and of course the law and regulation and all the things that government does to try and keep us safe and to try to build a prosperous society. So to delve into that second pool of unknowingness, I think, to try and think a little bit more about how on earth we all catch up with AI, what on earth we all do about it, what the big kind of like glaring questions are, and what we need to do in order to come through those questions. I'm now going to hand over to this incredibly distinguished cast of national, international authorities on this question. I'm going to give each around 10 minutes to make a kind of opening statement. We might then have a brief discussion amongst the panel, and then I'm going to throw it open to the audience to fire questions or thoughts back, and we'll rumble on in that way, I think, to around 8 o'clock this evening, if that sounds okay. So first then, I'm going to hand over to Professor Ian Goldin, the Oxford University Professor of Globalisation Development and Director of the Oxford Martin Programme on Technological and Economic Change. Ian, over to you.
Thank you very much. It's amazing to be here in a premises that used to have horse-drawn carts coming in, going up that ramp there, bringing people here, and then to come today by Uber. And think about technological change and how it reforms and transforms and of course improves lives. This would have been a very smelly place, full of horse manure then, and now it's a wonderful premises to be. What I want to talk a little bit about is both the opportunities and the risks and unknowns associated with this revolution. This revolution that's advancing at exponential speed, and some of the challenges that poses for a lot of our capability to understand it and our institutions, which are at best evolutionary. The excitement about AI is justified. I'm a firm believer that we're in a renaissance moment in history and that AI is as significant as the printing press was. It will change everything we know. It will change perspective. It will change the understanding of the world. It will change our understanding of our relationship to the universe. So it cannot be stated too strongly that this is a moment in history which will be transformed by AI. It will be, I believe, as significant as electricity and other revolutions in the way that it transforms the world. And at a pace which far exceeds that, because that took 50, 100 years to trickle around the world. Indeed, there's still places in the world that haven't been electrified. And in a global reach, which will be instantaneous in many areas. It will improve all of our lives. All of you have a much better chance of living long, good lives because of AI. You don't have to worry, looking around the room, about Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, dementia, and many other things I have to worry about because of AI and the capabilities that will come with that and machine learning to overcome cancer, neurodegenerative diseases, etc. It obviously will improve your knowledge and choice and will be an aid to you as we get embedded implants ready in the way that your mobile devices and others are, but in a much more intuitive and functioning way to make you even more effective. So that's the good news. What's very perplexing from an economist's point of view is why none of this is showing up at the moment. As you know, productivity is stagnating around the advanced economies. It's come down in all countries, the emerging and advanced economies. And so we have this real paradox of accelerating technological change, of which AI and machine learning is one manifestation, growing at exponential speed, but not the only one. Genomics and other things are parallel to that. What's happening in production technologies like 3D printing and many others as well. And at the same time, we're not seeing it in the data. So what's going on here? Is it actually happening in the way, or do we take Robert Gordon, who's written a big book on this, seriously when he says actually this is just a charade? The toilets were important, they prevented diseases. This is nothing like electricity or running water and purification. And I believe there are a whole lot of things. My phone has destroyed a lot of output. It's destroyed cameras, it's destroyed music machines, it's destroyed GPSs, it's destroyed many other things, and it gives me immense welfare benefits. So this disconnect between output and welfare, between material and non-material benefits, is being amplified, and the intangibles become more and more significant. That raises very, very big questions for economic policy. So this is the unknown area. It also raises big questions for tax policy because, for example, we have these new monopolies, the big four, Google, Amazon, etc., thriving off the frontiers of AI. And the big question is one of the reasons we're not seeing greater productivity is because these superstars are basically vacuuming up innovation, and that the zombie component of our economies is growing as a result. And obviously Belden Capital is very much at the forefront of trying to make those innovative firms become the new superstars, compete. But there's a big, big question. So AI, a wonderful thing. AI not showing up in the economic data. And AI, a terrifying thing. Now, there are two sides to what's going on with the terrifying. And both, let me draw on the work of the Oxford Martin School, which I've been the dean of for the first 10 years of its life. The one is what AI does to jobs, employment, and the future of meaningful work in countries. We estimate that about half of US jobs, about 60% of jobs in many developing countries, and about 40% of UK jobs could be done by machine intelligence within the next 20 years in the UK, other countries. Where are the jobs of the future? Only about half of 1% of the jobs we have today do not exist prior to the year 2000. A much slower rate of evolution of new jobs than old, and then the old jobs potential disappearing, and very different characteristics of those jobs. Gig working, no career, very much lower paid, and you have this bifurcation of the workforce into very high returns to people on the frontiers of AI and very low returns or unemployment to those that are basically replaced. Anything that is rules-based and repetitive, that does not require dexterity or great amounts of empathy, will be able to be done by machines within the next 10 or 20 years. And that's with existing technologies. This is not talking about what machine learning and other things will give capabilities to. This is not only old work like call centers, manufacturing, etc. This is also new work. Those of you that are lawyers, a lot of law will disappear. Accountancy, all of this sort of thing. Anything that's rules-based. So humans will be the creative engines of the world, which we should be. But how we do this in a way that is socially equitable is very, very important. We've done work that shows there's a direct correlation between vulnerability to robotics and machine intelligence and people voting for Trump and Brexit. This is politically absolutely relevant, and people are worried. So how AI becomes a force for good in the job market, employment market, what the implications are for equality and inequality, and what the implications are for tax and spend is very big. And there's a separate conversation about whether UBI, Universal Basic Income, is or isn't the answer. My answer to that is it's not. A second series of initiatives that have come out of Oxford is related to what we call malicious AI, or the abuse of AI. Now, what AI has is three characteristics which human engagement find much more difficult, which we believe need to be fought against. The first is that AI is developing to the capability where any voice, facial, and other recognition processes become meaningless, because we can now train AI to replicate. I can show you photographs of people, I can show you voice of people, I can infiltrate, and you will not tell the difference between a human and not. We've seen this in the fake news things around Russia and the US elections. It obviously was important in the UK and Brexit as well. So AI's capability to replicate human behavior, voice, facial, and other characteristics raise a very big question of entryism of different forces that control AI, and how we differentiate AI identity from human identity in all dimensions. And I know we'll discuss this in the context of fake news. It has very big implications, not only for the theft of your identity, but also, of course, for your assets and everything else, ideas, etc., and the replication and distortion, etc. A second key dimension is that AI has no ethical basis. It has no psychological transference. An AI machine can kill someone or do something without any guilt, and I know Kate will talk a bit about this. This makes AI very different to a human actor, because it all depends on the programming, and as we get into machine learning, it doesn't even depend on the programming, because the AI will teach itself what the optimal outcome is for a particular game it's playing, whether it's to capture a town or whether it's to capture a bank account or whatever. That disjuncture between decision-making and individual ethical rooting has extremely significant legal and other implications. Of course, when a driverless car runs someone over, there's all sorts of questions about who's ethically responsible, but this goes well beyond that, including in the drones. And the final thing is that the AI is advancing and democratizes capabilities. What does this mean? At the moment, only nation states can kill hundreds of thousands of people or millions of people. But with this capability, you can create, for example, a clean room. You can, with genomics and AI enhancements around genetic engineering, you can create measles, smallpox, Ebola, whatever you want to create for a couple of $100,000, put it on a drone and fly it down our streets. Now, this democratization of risk, which is the same thing that's happened in previous big democratization periods, changes the dynamics of society entirely. Everyone matters, and particularly people with AI capability matter and have power, which goes well beyond any power that previously existed for individuals. And of course, it's not only groups like jihadists that have that capability, it's all sorts of other people for whatever reason might want to use it. So individuals and trust and integrity and who we are and whether we know our brother and our neighbor becomes more and more important. Now, none of these negatives, I believe, outweigh the positives of AI, and we can use some AI and machine learning to also manage some of the negatives. But it's important that we get up to speed and recognize that this is not simply, as my Silicon Valley friends would have it, a force for good. This is a platform that can be used for immense good, but also we need to be conscious of the harms in order to ensure that the upside overwhelms the downside. Thank you.
Ian, thank you. I actually promised not to do this, but I am going to ask a follow-up question. So, Ian, immense power undoubtedly, and nothing inherent within AI is going to determine whether it's used for good or evil. So it seems that the kind of socio-political, moral context wherein it is created becomes the key determinant. Is it here in London, or is it in Silicon Valley, or is it elsewhere? Who is leading the world in AI, and who is going to be leading the world in AI?
Yeah, I think it's both the creators, but you know, scientists are basically inventors, and I don't think we can expect the scientists to hold the responsibility for the use of their applications, just like we couldn't blame Einstein for an atomic bomb or something. It's the societies, the regulations. I'm sure Kate will talk about this. It's the way in which we understand it and regulate it. Now, the interesting question is that a national global responsibility? And I believe increasingly it's going to require cooperation. Not only because I care whether they create superhumans somewhere else, but I also care if they create super pathogens somewhere else. And that is going to require a whole different degree of knowledge and capability. There's a big question as to how this connects to privacy and freedom, which, you know, is fascinating and we should discuss.
Well, Ian, thank you. And then on the cheery note of super pathogens, we now hand over, and I'm very pleased to welcome Baroness Kate Rock. Baroness Rock holds a number of non-executive directorships, a whole portfolio, including many technology companies, and also sits on the Artificial Intelligence Select Committee on within the House of Lords. So, Kate, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. I'm really delighted to be here. And actually, Ian, just to pick up on your last point, I think that global cooperation is absolutely key to the challenges and opportunities that the development of AI is bringing to us. And I think that that's something that we in the UK need to really drive in terms of the narrative and the agenda. I think that both industry, universities who are researching the technology, and businesses, both small, medium and large, really need to engage in the conversation. So I do wholeheartedly agree with that point. I think for me, I see artificial intelligence as actually more of a general purpose technology. It's really similar to electricity or the internet, with the capacity to facilitate and underpin many new ways of working. I think there is no such thing as the AI sector. There is an AI development sector and a wider technology sector, and both of which will have the potential to thrive in the UK. Indeed, I think AI will revolutionise and disrupt practically every sector. when we talk about artificial intelligence, we often talk about it as the technology of the future. I mean, it just isn't. It's, spam filters on your email, machine learning algorithms at work, learning to detect unwanted emails, uploading photographs to social media. We all do that. And we're prompted to tag the person in the image. It's neural networks powering facial recognition software to identify those in the photo. Shopping online. And being recommended what else to buy. I'm incredibly guilty of that. Something flashes up and 5 minutes later I find I've got far too many things in the basket. Sadly, it's artificial intelligence, once again, learning from the behavior of me, the consumer. So AI is here, and it has been here for some time. It's been helping people navigate the online world and increasingly the physical world for years, and it will continue to do so. So I want to just look a little bit around the economic, social, and ethical implications of advances in AI. And I think we should all be asking ourselves some important questions. How does AI affect our everyday lives, and how is this likely to change them? What are the possible risks of AI? And Ian has already talked about some of that, and we'll perhaps come back to that in general discussion. And what ethical issues will be presented to us by the development of AI? And again, I think this is an incredibly important area. The importance of education and the importance of public understanding and awareness of the applications of AI. And finally, what are the potentials in the UK? I just want to touch on a few sort of points just in general, and then if I may just come back to some of the things that the UK government are doing. In terms of jobs, I think AI is often positioned as a sort of looming employment issue. Well, we've talked a little bit about productivity, and I do see it as an opportunity to address some productivity issues with evolving technology. And indeed, on productivity, I think there is the opportunity for more widespread use of AI to improve the productivity issues that we do have in the UK. We have strong skill sets here. We have an opportunity. And I believe that if we do adopt AI, it will increase efficiencies, cost savings, and go towards the overall economic growth across all industries. But in order to do all of that, we must be educated, and we need to improve the digital literacy and skills for the workplace of the future. I think it's incredibly important that we understand the technology and that we do enable people to navigate an increasingly digital world. And through that, inform the debate about how AI should and should not be used. And that probably comes on to ethics. Many companies involved in AI are actually producing their own code of ethics. And I'd like to throw this out to the audience later, do we need a consistent, international, and widely recognised ethical guidelines? Do we need a sort of code of conduct? Will this become a basis for perhaps some statutory regulation? Just coming back to what the government is doing to support AI, it's very clear that governments across the globe are taking a much more active interest in AI. As a member of the House of Lords and Select Committee on AI, I welcome the speed and huge enthusiasm, and Ian and I touched on this when we were speaking earlier, about how the government has met the emergence of AI. And indeed, there are many, many reports that have recently come out, but I'd like to focus very briefly on just two. The first, which I'm sure you've all seen, is the Hall-Percenti review. This is a very widespread review, but it has 18 recommendations, which I promise you I will not go through. But they do focus on skills, the increasing adoption of AI, and ensuring data is used properly and securely. And data is something that, again, I think we should broaden out the conversation on. And the review also talks about building the UK's AI research capacity. The second one is the government's industrial strategy white paper, which was published at the end of last year. And there are a number of very AI-focused recommendations in that paper. The first is the establishment of an industry-led AI council, which will take a leadership role across all sectors. This council is going to be supported by a new government office for artificial intelligence. And this office is designed to increase awareness of the advantages of data and analytical technologies and promote greater diversity in the AI workforce. It will work across industries like the cybersecurity, life sciences, construction, manufacturing, energy, and agriculture technology. And I think importantly, the government is also going to create the first ever advisory body. It's putting £9 million towards this for the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation. And this body is going to advise government on how they can enable and ensure safe, ethical, and groundbreaking innovation in AI and data-driven technologies. I know that they're looking for people to join the body, so anybody's interested, please do apply. There is also a huge amount of investment going into education. There's extra money for supporting additional PhDs, extra money for supporting startups. I'm sure Balderton will be delighted to hear that. Perhaps not enough towards scale-ups, but certainly a lot towards startups. And next generation services, to name a few. As a member of the House of Lords Committee, we are going to be publishing a report in April, which I hope you'll all be reading. And I hope that we're going to be providing some strong recommendations to the government on some of the next steps around the future of AI. And I would welcome any thoughts and ideas. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. And a very quick question for you, if you don't mind. So one of the things I've always been worried about is speed when it comes to digital technology and its associated clusters. One of the things that Ian spoke about was exponential change. So not only that it's getting better and faster and more powerful, but the rate at which it's getting better and faster and more powerful is itself increasing. As a kind of parliamentarian, do you think that can you pass laws quickly enough? Can you get regulation out there quickly enough? Is this kind of posing a whole new kind of challenge to Parliament, to government, to actually just simply keep up with a thing which is just only getting faster every moment of every day?
I suppose the answer to publishing, to getting laws and legislation through quickly is that it can go as fast or as slow as the parliamentarians actually push it through. So it's absolutely astonishing how some things can go through extremely quickly and some things take a lot of time. I think on the regulations around, or maybe not the regulations around, but the investment and the enthusiasm around this particular area, there is little doubt that this is a cross-party enthusiasm. And I think that irrelevant of the colour of the government, I think you're going to see some very fast and forward-thinking new investment and new government support for it, because I do think that there is a very strong feeling that the UK, and perhaps we can come back to this, has the potential to really drive the agenda in terms of AI. And I know that the Government Secretary of State, Matthew Hancock, is particularly keen on promoting artificial intelligence as in the UK and trying to ensure that we become a global leader. So, sorry, long-winded answer, but it entirely depends, really.
All right. Well, thank you, Kate. And now we're very lucky also to be joined by Charlie Beckett, a professor in the Media and Communications Department at the LSE, not of journalism, I was told before we joined. And we're also lucky because Charlie is literally in the middle of one of the biggest kind of igniting kind of controversies which we're currently trying to deal with in public policy. It says here, Charlie, the public information crisis within the UK. It hasn't used the phrase fake news. But Charlie's also leading the Truth, Trust and Technology Commission, a massively important new thing which everyone is looking to try and get some answers around how the information and journalistic landscape is changing. So Charlie, thank you very much for coming this evening, and over to you now.
Great. Good evening. I guess my bit is like a case study. You've heard two superb kind of overviews of the significance of artificial intelligence. I'm going to sort of concentrate on the thing that I love, which is journalism. And in a sense, I am the case study. I used to be a journalist. In fact, my last job was just around the corner at Channel 4 News at ITN. But when I started on the South London Press quite some time ago, this was in an era when my telephone was attached to the floor by a wire. I wrote upon a typewriter, and you could smoke at your desk, which was fantastic. And since then, the history of my career, if you like, has been one of constant technological change. You know, the introduction of video, and of course, the internet. And in fact, when I first went to Channel 4 News in 1999, you had to ask, can I have my go on the internet, please? Because there was only one PC where you could access it. Now, the point of this is that, you know, in the last 10 years when I've been at the LSE, running this think tank called Polis, I've been looking at journalism change, media change more generally. So in some senses, we have a lot of precedents here. Ian mentioned the classic one, the invention of printing, but much more recently in journalism, we've had these other examples of where technology has come along, and as both people have mentioned, there are wonderful opportunities, and also there are some downsides, to put it mildly. And that happens alongside all sorts of other changes. You know, journalism has changed for lots of other, market reasons, sociology reasons, as well as the tech reasons. And back in 2008, I wrote a book called Supermedia, and it was about how tech was changing journalism. And basically, the main thing I thought, as an old dinosaur kind of journo, was, gosh, this is amazing stuff, what you can do with this. The efficiency and the effectiveness of journalism, thanks to these technology, just, you know, it was almost like magic to me, what you could do. But I think those changes, and they obviously the internet and then social media and so on, but I think Ian's right. I think AI is far, far more important, including to journalism. And of course, you can have super media, you can have super good things happening, but you can also have super bad things happening as well. And as Carl mentioned, we're doing this LSE Commission on Truth, Trust and Technology. It's a big sort of engagement exercise with lots of different sectors, and not just the journos, but also the technologists and civil society. Because the one thing that struck me when that whole fake news, and that's the last time I'll use that phrase tonight, because Donald has now turned that into meaning something else, where it just means news that I disagree with. But the whole information crisis, I realise, is not just about journalism. It's not even just about social media. It's about a whole range of stakeholders and issues. And as Kate has said, this is about how we respond as individuals, but more importantly, perhaps, as communities and societies. But for me, I am very, very excited about AI and machine learning. I think the potential, and it's already happening, as Kate said, this is already happening in journalism. It's transforming the way you get information, and certainly the news media, it's changing it already. And it's dealing, I think, with there are three huge problems that the news media has. One, when I say the news media, I mean you as consumers of it, as well as us, or my mates, as producers of it. First one is there's a massive overabundance of information, of news and data. The problem used to be there wasn't enough. Now the problem is there's so much, so the question is, how do we connect people to the good stuff that's useful for them? And I think AI obviously has extraordinary potentiality to do that. Second huge problem around journalism is credibility. So misinformation, disinformation, just bad journalism, if you like. And again, I think AI has extraordinary possibilities to improve the credibility of journalism, and also our literacy and our understanding and possibly even our trust in it. Third big problem facing the news media is the business model. It's screwed for all sorts of reasons, mainly the advertising crisis, but lots of other reasons. And I think AI offers amazing chances for journalism to do things like avoid duplication, to add value, and to be much more relevant and efficient at giving you the stuff that's going to interest you and create, give you good information and give you good debate as well. I think that's very important. Couple of caveats about AI and journalism. Journalism is a bit weird. Narratives are actually quite difficult to program for. You're still going to need a human element. Artificial intelligence obviously at some point needs human input, so I would argue you're still going to need skilled journalists both to sort of check on what the algorithms are doing, but also to kind of interpret them. And finally, the caveat is that artificial intelligence can certainly increase quant. It can do the quantity, the speed, for example, but quality is another issue, and that is in the end, I would say in journalism, that's going to be a human editorial decision. So loads of fantastic opportunities. I won't list them all. I've actually put my notes on my blog if you want to see a whole list of cases where AI is going to improve journalism, all sorts of things. For example, the way that it can help us with instant news when there are major events. It can help us understand what people are talking about so journalists can get better at listening. It can help with things like fact-checking. Fact-check, the UK, full fact, sorry, the UK fact-checking have now developed live AI-driven verification processes. Lots of personalisation. There's a wonderful news startup called Compass News, for example. I recommend you check it out. It's kind of aimed at millennials, and they're using AI-driven curation to, again, to sort of connect you to the news that interests you, but also perhaps offers you a kind of diversity that you may not have been expecting. So loads of interesting ways you can use it as tools. Whole new platforms, and you have to think about Alexa, for example, augmented reality, and Ian's mentioned blockchain, of course. That's a fascinating potential sort of decentralized way of doing data information and journalism. Obviously, as people have said, there are going to be negatives. The most obvious one that you're probably all reading about is around disinformation, propaganda, all those little Russian bots. I don't know if you saw the stuff around the Florida shooting, with all those YouTube videos with conspiracy theories about the so-called crisis actors. And you could see there how the magnificent resources and revenue and expertise of Google, i.e. YouTube, how they struggled to cope with the way that people were gaming the algorithms to keep pushing, the so-called fake news back up to the top of the lists. So there's lots of other sort of potential downsides as well. And for me, it sort of boils down to three big sort of structural questions for journalism as it sets about excitedly trying to use all these wonderful tools. Firstly, does mainstream media, which has really struggled actually with tech, does mainstream media have the skills and the insight and the knowledge and the resources to actually understand and deploy artificial intelligence and machine learning? And if it is going to make extraordinary efficiencies, are they just going to stick the money in the back pocket, or are they going to use that to create better additional value-added journalism? Secondly, I think there's a big set of structural issues around trust and transparency, which of course I think is absolutely critical for journalism. I think it matters less if you're shopping, frankly, but I think it matters a lot around journalism. How will we know, for example, who has created content, who has shaped it, if it's being done through AI, which is, relatively invisible? journalists are sort of visible. You can see them on Twitter at least. You can sort of shout at them and measure them and regulate them. Much, much harder to know what's going on when it's with artificial intelligence. And how do you hold them accountable? You know, how do you hold algorithms accountable? And then finally, I think there's an issue around power. So there's the issues around the biases, you know, algorithmic biases. If it's white males developing AI in California, how do they understand the social impact of what they're doing? But also it's about power. Inevitably, and we've seen this already, haven't we, with the way that journalism has had to go on to platforms like Twitter and Facebook, and it then is in a sense surrendering its ability to control the quality and the impact of the journalism. Now, in a way, that's a good thing. I'm a journalist, but I actually welcome, one of my big themes over the last 10 years is that as journalism becomes more networked and open, that does offer at least a potentiality for a more, if you like, democratic, participatory kind of news media. Of course, a lot of bad people or actors have entered into that marketplace because the barriers have gone down. But the same thing applies to AI. Who is going to control those technologies, and how are we as journalists, but more importantly, as consumers of journalism, how are we able to get the kind of information and debate that we think is healthy for us and the communities that we live in?
Thank you very much, Charlie. And I can't help but ask: is there any way that you could bring kind of us in on the current thinking around the Commission when it comes to trying to combat fake news? It kind of seems to be one of these problems, the kind of application of malicious automation, where the kind of offensive side has all the tricks, and there seems to be so little that we can actually do to defend against it. So is there any kind of is there any ways in which the Commission is pointing, or kind of possible solutions it's looking at?
Well, we're sort of halfway through, and I'm in that dreadful phase where, you know, when I started wanting to do this commission, it was because of I was in the States after the presidential election, and I could see the sheer terror in the eyes of liberal journalists in America who realised that not only was their business model screwed, but they had completely failed to understand what was happening in America. And here was a guy coming along who wanted to crush their values and indeed their business. So, and I realised very quickly that, you know, you can't address this until an issue brought in the tech companies and so on. So I thought, yes, something must be done. That classic LSE idea. We've got to understand the causes of things, but then we must try and do something. I'm now at the phase where I think, shit, anything you do has got such downsides and it's so complex. And also there's a lot of moral panic. I think anybody who tries to deal with so-called fake news because they didn't like Brexit or they don't like Trump, I think is making a real mistake, because they're ignoring the real reasons why those things happen. But I would put it into two buckets. Yes, I think there is stuff you can do. You know, stuff like fact-checking. Marvellous. Although who actually bothers to look at fact-check stuff? It's the kind of people who weren't reading conspiracy theories in the first place. But the other side of it, which I think is almost more important, is how do you build capacity for better information? You know, how do you, in a sense, create more good journalism that people can access, that's useful for them, that they understand? So I think, for example, with media literacy, you know, I agree with you, Kate, there's a lot can be done around that. But the idea that media literacy can be solved in classrooms, well, that's nice. I mean, I work in a university, so it's a good thing. But that is no solution. The real media literacy or digital literacy happens in our everyday experience. And it happens because the technology companies and the journalists themselves become much more media digitally literate. And I think AI is a great tool potentially to help with that. Although I really do agree with Ian that to see it just as a tool is very reductionist. It is transformational. Social media transformed journalism in all sorts of interesting ways, ethical, political, as well as business. And I think we're still going to grapple with how AI is actually going to reconfigure how we understand news as an entity, let alone journalism as a business.
Charlie, thank you. So everybody, you are about to bring your own intelligence in this discussion. So start warming up your questions because we're about to go over to you to start firing questions, comments, challenges back to the panel. But before we do so, I want to kind of give a kind of invitation to the panelists. I think there's kind of much that is obviously, I think, all you three agree upon. I mean, I think everybody agrees that this is massively important and transformational. I think pretty much everyone agrees that this is, the technology itself is morally agnostic and the application of it is what really matters about whether it does good or bad. And everyone agrees about the importance of skills and public understanding and in general, kind of political cognizance and good law and regulations being one of the ways in which we can shape it. I don't want to like manufacture controversy, but I do want to give everyone a chance to actually, I genuinely think the surfacing where we disagree is actually as important. So I do want to give each speaker an invitation, which they don't have to take up, just to kind of like, politely perhaps land on a kind of challenge, a comment or a claim that one of the other speakers made, which is something they want to explore further. Yeah, of course.
Sorry, hi. Ian and I talked about this a little earlier, and Ian did touch on it, about who is going to sort of effectively win the arms race when it comes to development of AI. And I think in your remarks you mentioned America. And I suppose my question to you is, do you think that we in the UK have the ability, the talent, the skills, the ambition to be at the forefront of the development of AI, and who would the other countries that you would consider to be challenging us? Or do you think it's not a global arms race? Do you think it's a global collaboration?
Well, let me, for the sake of some frisson, give some different views. I think basically the leaders are going to be the US and China. One of the things that AI is doing is it's concentrating intellectual capital, and this is one of the reasons we're not seeing productivity growth, is because it's actually concentrating the division between the superstars who are doing incredibly well, and they buy up, they vacuum clean the market of anything promising, and the long tails. The UK's chance of being, with all due respect to a former or current very close associate of the government, the UK's chance of being a real intellectual leader and heavyweight has been blown by Brexit. Because if the UK is going to play heavyweight, it's going to play through the European Union as being the leader in Europe of this debate. And it could have been, and it was. And the great tragedy of AI leadership in the UK is, amongst the many tragedies, is that it's withdrawn from that opportunity. So I think the UK is great, Valdeden's great, there's a lot of great players, we have DeepMind here, there's a lot of wonderful things happening. Oxford University, of course, is great. We will play. And it's interesting that on the report on malicious AI was led, again, by Oxford. We overweight. We will play way above our weight. But when you are number 6 and you're playing as number 4, it's different to being number 2 or number 1. And that's, I think, where we're at. Of course, that means that we need to collaborate. Part of that collaboration comes down to things like immigration policy. Are we allowing the best minds in the world to come to our universities and to work here afterwards? And if the answer is no, because we don't give them visas, well, that's like shooting ourselves in another foot. So things like that really matter. One of the reasons Silicon Valley is great is because virtually any iconic firm you can think of is a foreign-founded firm. Half the patents in the US are foreign. That's not an accident. That's because of their immigration policy. And they also, I think, going to shoot themselves in another foot on that one. Just if I can now do a challenge. Sorry if I was a bit too undiplomatic, but you can come back as well.
Can I just respond on...
Okay.
And I'd just like to respond on one thing. I don't disagree with anything you've said, Ian. I think one of the things that I think that the UK could very easily do is champion the ethical side of AI. And I think that that is something that we really should be absolutely looking at. And I think that the announcement recently that the Turing Institute, which is one of the most amazing international brand names in the world, can do, is really drive that ethical debate and guidelines. So I think
I
we
agree.
could find an area, I'm not saying it's the technology or that side of it.
Yeah, and Rohan Silva did a really good op-ed in one of the papers or somewhere in the last week, basically arguing this point that as a liberal democracy, the UK's position on AI is fundamentally different, and that's where the UK should play, is in rights and AI, in the rights and AI space. And if it can do that, I think that's really interesting and important, and obviously very different to China and perhaps different to the US as well. So I absolutely agree with you. I guess my challenge perhaps to Charlie would be what I totally agree that that the democratization of social media and that disinformation have determined outcomes. But I think what I'm feeling at the moment, particularly from our work that we've done, which shows that people that were more vulnerable to artificial intelligence, robotics, voted for Trump and Brexit, that underneath this is actually real economy, jobs, incomes, wages, opioid addiction, real, hillbillyology. That what AI has done is it's made, far from what Tom Friedman suggests, the world more flat. It's made the world much more mountainous. And those on the mountaintops in the dynamic cities like London, this area of London not least, San Francisco, New York, they love change. We all love change. We embrace it. But increasingly what AI is doing is fracturing our societies because it's making us more mountainous. It's making place and skill more important. And then compounding that is things like house prices, transport systems, and others, which are reducing the potential for mobility. So yes, of course, if we had better and more honest news, we'd have a better system. But the people who are voting for Trump, and I would argue who voted for Brexit, they're not interested. I know this. They are not interested in the fact that it will ruin their facts. They're basically saying, we are not going to benefit from this. We are the losers. And unless we can address the fundamentals which underpin this system, I don't think we're going to win the battle on saying to people, here's a good news channel, listen to it, and here's a bad news channel, don't listen to that, or a good new information system, or bad journalism, or good... Because they are basically wanting people to show their anger, to show their distaste for the system and for what the people in the coastal and other dynamic cities are doing. And I think that is the more fundamental problem, is we can create all the genuine information we want, but we're not going to succeed unless we deal with the fundamentals.
Thanks very much. Charlie, over to you. Please, reasonably brief, please, so we can throw it out to the audience.
Just say, God, it's such a huge agenda. And funnily enough, the glib response is, well, nothing much has changed. There was a bit of an illusion that somehow there was some golden age where we were all wonderfully well informed and we all sat around swapping our newspapers and having a wonderful deliberative think before we went out and voted. We funnily enough, digital and social media has, in a sense, made it more manifest that was always bollocks,
Always read the Daily Mail.
Yeah, exactly. People always read the Daily Mail or the Guardian, etc. And I certainly think you have to speak about the limits of media. Although, if you are going to worry, for example, about, and this I just can't get this out of my head now, these drones with the pathogen drones. Sorry, this is my tabloid side coming out. I can just see the headline, germ drones coming to a high street near you. Now, journalism is really good at telling you this shit is going to happen. It's quite good at saying, panic, and then afterwards, right, try and think, and perhaps here's a bit of information as well. And my only hope is that these tools can help what is a struggling industry, especially at the local level, funnily enough, to at least win an information battle. But you're quite right, one of the things we have seen, for example, we've got fantastic journalism. We've got more great journalism in the UK and globally than ever before. Trouble is, it's people like you that are accessing it. You're intelligent enough, you're rich enough to get those subscriptions from The Economist and the FT and The Guardian. And The Guardian is using AI and so on. They're all using AI and similar technologies to connect better to you, to personalise the experience, to get you to subscribe. The trouble is, it's a tiny minority. So you're quite right, there's a news gap. There's super elite who are super elite in other ways, are also becoming informationally elite. And that's why it's important to remember that human social element, including things like, funny old-fashioned concepts like public service media. So there are policies that you can do to still sort of shape that, whilst understanding exactly there are forces driving in different directions.
Thank you, Johnny. I'm going to ask you to save your challenge if you have one for one of your responses. So we have half an hour. You've got a very broad canvas there of actually a dizzying, I think, variety of different issues that you might want to touch on or ask about. So I'm not going to try and structure this very much, at least at the start. I think I'm just on anything that you've heard this evening, whether it's about politics and whether it's about fake news and journalism, a much broader idea of what is happening, both good and bad. Over to you. Questions, comments, challenges, requests for further information. Madam, do we have a roving mic? We've now repurposed one of our mics, roving mic. Okay. I may have to inform you this is being videoed. That might mean that you might want to say if you don't want to be videoed, if you're asking a question. I'm sure we can take that out afterwards.
I'm okay with being videoed, so it's fine.
Okay, she's good with being videoed.
Go ahead. This is primarily a question for Baroness Rock, but interested to hear everyone else's thoughts as well. And this came to my mind when we were talking about the UK's role in the future and how we could have a role with ethics. So I'm from Cancer Research UK, so I'm very interested in the House of Lords report and everything that's coming out from the government. And so, especially thinking post-Brexit and thinking everything we can do with artificial intelligence in terms of our academic performance in the UK, but also our role in ethics, it's kind of similar to what we see in life sciences, where we're really brilliant with medical research. We're less good at getting that innovation into the NHS and helping patients. So when it comes to technology and AI, how do you see that working in the NHS? How do we actually use that to drive performance, specifically in cancer services, obviously, but in the NHS as a whole? What do you see that happening in future?
Thank you. It's a fantastically good question. And I do agree with you. I think that historically we have struggled to turn our sort of academic research into sort of commercial potential. I think we're getting a lot better at it, but I think we still have quite a long way to go. I mean, I suspect you'll have some views on this as well. I think that particularly on the NHS, and I think this is really a data question, and actually perhaps one can involve the BBC in this as well. We have two incredibly amazing public institutions in both the BBC and the NHS who have a huge amount of data. And there has to be the potential to use those data sets for good. And there has been quite a lot of controversy, I think, around the DeepMind and Moorfields connection, and I don't necessarily have a view either way on that. But I think that we do need to look at how effectively we can use data from big public institutions towards things like healthcare, and particularly around cancer research and other genetically difficult areas. So I think that, again, that comes from a push from sectors, from business, around making sure that, again, that we use what we have to push the agenda forward on the global scale. But I would love to be able to say, yes, we should be using all the data for things like that.
Okay, thank you. I know we do have representatives of the BBC here. I don't want to single anyone out, but if the BBC does want to offer, someone from the BBC does want to offer a thought about the public data they hold and how it might be used for good, please do put your hand up. Oh, that is a hand? Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mark.
Hello. Well, you can't lose an opportunity like that, can you? Look, I agree with you. I think that the BBC, like any big public organisation, can use data, but there are all sorts of issues of privacy and rights and access, and a lot of the data that we have, we don't store for very good reasons. There's GDPR, which is coming in May, which poses a whole another challenge to us, as it does to every public organisation as well. So the idea that everyone's data is accessible through a public organisation. Many people access BBC services that don't sign into them. So, I think there's a challenge to the public and their willingness to be tracked in that way, to have their data stored in that way. What access do others then have to that data? How is it secured? There are a whole host of questions that emerge out of that. So it may be a very worthy intention, but I think there are a whole series of
I'm not saying
issues.
it's not without its complications, and I think that we haven't really talked about this. I think we haven't talked about, use of personal data. We haven't really talked about anonymisation, even if you can anonymise data, because if you have ML going one way, can you not have ML going the other way? So I'm not saying it's without its issues, but I'm saying that I think if one wants to go in that direction, you need to find solutions around some of the obstacles that we do face. But I agree with you. I think the whole data argument is and personal data particularly is very, why would anybody want their personal data used and out there? So I agree that that is an issue.
While I've got the mic, could I just ask a quick follow-up?
All right, seeing as you did volunteer yourself.
Because I was struck by, there was quite a lot of discussion about regulation and in terms of ethics, but the algorithms are what powers a lot of what we're talking about, and the algorithms are not easy for us either to determine or regulate or get inside of. Whether you're a government policy maker, you might have the best of intentions, but these are down to the companies that have built them in the first instance. And I'd be just interested in your perspective on that, because quite a lot of this is out of the control of an organisation, a government, a body. Much of the things that, Charlie, you're working on may have very good intention, but what can we actually do about these things?
So I'm going to thank you for that question. I'm going to take 3 more. I think everyone who wants to ask questions should be able to. So please keep them quite short and sharp, and we'll get as many in, and we'll come back to the panel after that. So, Sir, Madam, Sir at the back. You know what? Take this one.
Thanks a lot. So I run a startup that uses AI to optimize facility and property management, and we're seeing some pretty strong gains in terms of efficiency. It's kind of a big picture question, I guess. Do you kind of see, I think maybe in 3 years, 4 years, 5 years time, we're going to see facilities that actually are managed much more effectively and efficiently by AI rather than, say, an operations director somewhere on a board. And I think, do you see that kind of scaling up, maybe even to democratic bodies like governments, where actually the decisions are being made by AI and human actors are providing ethical, maybe backing for that?
So AI within government and death of the operations director. So, Madam, do you have a microphone? Can you pass it back?
Hi. Oh, got two. So that's really embarrassing because that was almost the same question I was going to ask, which is if you take Professor Golding's definition of an AI-threatened job as being rules-based, repetitive and non-dexterous, which I would say MPs' jobs are, then at what point do you define an end for AI's capabilities? And if you are inputting, so I work with AI at work, but I advise businesses for what they can do for consumers based on AI. And the issue that we have is that customers input their preferences once, and then the AI will continue to run based on those historical preferences, and the updates don't really happen. So my question is then, how do you update your preferences in these systems?
I've got a question. Beyond the blunt instrument of legislation, how can we drive drive AI as a force for good as opposed to a force for usefulness? Everyone quotes Alexa as this great thing, but it's essentially very useful and therefore profitable. But it was only when the government's internet safety strategy told the social media companies, we're going to crack down on you, that they've started to say, oh, actually, we'll do lots more AI to protect children and young people online, and therefore be a force for good. But beyond the legislation, they weren't going to do that. How can we, in general, make it more a force for good other than what the government can force them to do?
Thank you. So I know there's a lot more people wanting to come in. So each speaker, there's 4 questions there, and you have a minute to answer which of them that you want before we go back out.
AI solve that problem. Regulation, yes, I think there's multiple layers of regulation. Well, one whole question is, which was posed by Carl, is can the regulators keep up? I think there's immense regulatory questions. There's big questions at the macro level about privacy. We are all giving up our data and not being paid for it. There's a question of who appropriates the value of our data. There's massive questions around the tax and all that. There's very big regulatory questions around competition and monopoly practices. Are we allowing one firm to control all the data, or one firm to deliver all the packages and things? Those are all competition policy, privacy policy. They fundamental, go to the heart of government and the heart of what we should be voting for governments about in regulation. Of course, it's catch-up. I'm from finance. There's massive issues in finance to stop the next financial crisis related to AI as well. So absolutely, regulation is central. The question of facilities management, they're really, of course, and they have been for the last 15 years, AI operating systems managing facilities, and they're companies who are doing incredibly well. There's a downside to this. You have a totally enabled building, which I've been into. I've been into a hotel, it's totally AI enabled, and then I couldn't get into my room after running in the morning. And I was opening a conference on AI enabled buildings, so that was fun. And the fire brigade ended up breaking the door down. AI is wonderful. Our trust in AI control will, because it's a black box, they couldn't decode this thing to open the door. It will go so far as the trust and integrity, and this is true of all AI systems. Otherwise, we'll revert. And I think, yes, if your company has the trusted AI that doesn't ever fail, then you will be very successful.
You're going over your minute, I'm afraid.
Okay, the drive for good, yes.
Yeah, broadly on the sort of so-called regulation thing, I wrote recently about drawing a very sort of crude comparison between bankers and tech companies. You know, we didn't actually do much to sort out the banks, did we, after the financial crisis? It was so complex, they were so powerful, the culture was so, if you like, in their favour. And I think there's a similar problem with the tech companies. Also a similar problem in that the tech companies are, all their incentives are quite, specific to their business. again, it's a whole set of complex issues that we as legislators or commentators or citizens find difficult to understand. And I think AI is exponentially going to increase that problem. But I think you can think about so-called regulation in different ways. There's a kind of negative thing you can do, stop them allowing pornographic videos or paedophile videos on YouTube or something. But then there's positive things as well. So you can, with health, for example, we have, regulations on drugs. But then we also did something very positive in this country. We created something called the NHS. So I think I think those are the ways of looking at it, rather than thinking, is there a regulatory way to make AI virtuous or good? One final thing, I talked earlier, a lot of my work has been about, networked journalism, opening journalism up. I'm very attracted by the blockchain, decentralized journalism. But the one thing I did get wrong over the last 10 years was underestimating the value of human-centered institutions, enabled, of course, by technology and so on. So, for example, a newsroom, is actually quite a clever thing to have an institution where it's legally protected, it has an identity, has a brand, has a sort of a community of collaboration or thinking and inspiration or even conflict, competition. So I think we need to think about how AI fits into perhaps new forms of human-centered, kind of looser, perhaps, institutions. But I think I think perhaps a better way forward than thinking about what are the rules that's going to make AI good.
Thanks. I think, the emergence of new technology is inevitably going to challenge the existing, legal frameworks and regulatory frameworks. And I think one has to be quite fleet of foot at looking at some of this. I think, for me, the big issue is around accountability, actually. And I think we're going to have to come up with some answers on this. And we do need some clear principles. So, if you're going to have an algorithm that's making a decision that has an impact on someone's life, whether it's, about receiving a mortgage or diagnosing an illness, or, as Ian alluded to, a decision about an automated vehicle, I think we're going to have, or even, criminal misuse. I think we are going to need to have a clear understanding of the frameworks around it, and I think that accountability is going to be a very big part of that discussion.
So we will go back to the speakers for final reflections at the end, but there's time for at least one more wave of questions before that. So who else wants to jump in? So I will take 3 more. Sir, is there a final one? Oh, there's a whole chair load of people over there. One of you, and you can work it out which one it is.
So there's an adage, in a lot of AI, is that, you tell your investors you're doing AI. When you're hiring, you tell the guy he's going to be doing machine learning. When you do it yourself, you're doing linear regression and possibly non-linear regression if things get a bit spicy. But no one's going to show up to the select committee on linear regression. Is there a danger that, with prophetic visions of a utopian or dystopian future, we're ignoring a rather more prosaic now, which is that something that, tells me that something is cat or is dog, is not, and also that the solutions to a lot of the problems now are actually quite prosaic. Monopolies, law around competition is well established, and actually really we just need to use the existing tools a bit more aggressively.
Very good question. Sometimes evil is boring.
Quite a few analysts say that one of the reasons why China could have potential dominance in AI advance is their, from what I understand, complete lack of data protection and the advantage this gives in training AIs. Brexiteers are quite fond of talking about the many vaguely sketched out opportunities that lie on the other side of that great moment. Do we think perhaps that the whole-scale removal of all European data protection and, I guess, pre-existing British data protection could actually be an interesting such opportunity?
Thank you very much. And then a question, and is there a fourth, if a fourth person wants to come in on this round, stick your hand up at the end.
I run a small business, and we're already at the point where I can replace a member of staff with some Watson underwritten technologies. Professor Golding touched on universal income earlier on. A bit further down the line than maybe some of the other questions, but a thing or not a thing? That's my question.
Sometimes abuses can be prosaic. Maybe lifting all the data protection standards will actually be a benefit, and UBI, especially for Professor Golding.
Okay, let me deal with 1 and 3 and leave Kate to deal with 2. Prosaic, I don't think so, because we have to prepare now for what is advancing extremely rapidly. There really are very, very significant AI questions. AI is already determining many, many outcomes, but it's really a question of, are we gearing ourselves up for what AI will overwhelm in health systems, in judicial systems, in choices on jobs, etc. So I think, yes, at the moment, as Bob Gordon has argued, we're not seeing it, but I'm absolutely convinced, and I'd want you to, I didn't hear you arguing otherwise, that we will have both the utopian and dystopian outcomes. And the more we can focus on them and understand them, the more we'll balance ourselves in favor of the utopian, and big choices, including on privacy. UBI, well, I mean, it's sort of like you've opened my door. So there are 5 reasons why UBI is a very bad idea. The one is that it's financially totally unaffordable. The second is that it is a socially disastrous thing to just pay people to stay at home and not work. People get meaning networks, etc., out of work. The third is because people find wherever they go that they have to, in the end, reskill for other jobs and things, and UBI is a preference not to do that. The fourth is because UBI is basically a substitute for a much deeper conversation regarding jobs. And the fifth is because when UBI is presented, it is always in the context of rich countries that have very low unemployment. So people are all talking about Finland now, or Alaska now, or something like that. And of course, that is a very different sort of world into a world where you have half of your workers unemployed, or let alone a developing country world where you don't have great surpluses to pay. So UBI, I believe, is a red herring. I believe that we should be supporting people that are out of work in our society. We should have very strong safety nets, but that also requires a fundamental rethink about the future of jobs. Part-timism, paying people for work they do now, which is currently unpaid, including care work, which will become a much bigger thing, homework, etc. In other words, I think we need a really fundamental conversation of an AI-enabled work environment, and that UBI is a substitute, which is very distracting for that.
Thank you, Kate.
Thank you. Well, I think, you know, whilst I don't think AI is the sort of the all-conquering as the hype may lead us to believe, and so I think, but I think it is going to change the way that that we work and the world around us. So, I think the most important thing on this, around your point about the existing tools, is that it's about evolution, not revolution. And I think that's sort of where we need to be in terms of grappling with quite an opaque nature of AI. It is necessary that we are a more informed society on that point. On the question around China and data protection and the removal of data protection, in my opinion, no.
I was going to say, what was the question? Yeah. That was the one I really thought your point was really the incremental bit. I think you've got a point, you know, and I was thinking about journalism in particular. I was thinking about someone like, we sort of had something equivalent to the Industrial Revolution that's happened. There's digital revolution. And yet, I can imagine someone like Charles Dickens, who was a journalist back in the 1830s, I think. I can imagine him still walking into the Times newsroom or the BBC or even BuzzFeed, actually, and doing a pretty good job as a journalist, strangely, you know. So in some ways, things do not change in their functionality and purpose and so on. And so you're right, you don't necessarily have to reinvent all the structures around them. But it is interesting watching how change happens differently. So, for example, when I think about the whole information sort of fake news thing, massively different in its operation and impact in America, for all sorts of reasons, than it has been in Europe, for example, or in China. You know, they have much less of a fake news problem in China because they don't have much open news at all. So, now obviously I do think, I've got to think there's a crisis in public information. Otherwise, I have to stop doing my commission. And it's really interesting. So I'd like to keep going. So I think there is a crisis, but I'd like to put it more as a kind of critical point. And I think when you're at a critical point, you need people like Ian who are trying to understand what the thing is first, and then people like Kate trying to have a broader public conversation about how that thing might change the way we lead our lives. But I agree with you that talk of either dystopian or utopian implies a kind of such a massive upheaval that history tells us technology does not work like that.
Thank you very much, Charlie. And we have fortuitously basically 3 minutes left. So I'm gonna stay with the panel. I'm gonna ask for final parting thoughts, kind of staying with this idea of this being a kind of like really key pivotal moment in our history. What is the kind of singular idea that you want people in the audience to leave this room still thinking about? How do we all help in trying to ensure that AI becomes a force for good rather than evil? Ian, over to you first.
Well, I'm just bouncing off what Charlie said. Actually, history doesn't tell us that disruptive change gets absorbed. What history tells us is that periods of massive disruptive change are massively tumultuous, disruptive, can lead to fascism, can lead to religious wars, can lead to all sorts of other dystopian outcomes. That's what history teaches us. The long term is very nice. Everyone has better, higher quality, nice jobs. In the short term, there are wars. In Britain, there were 5 times the number of troops put on to face domestic rebellious workers than they were to go and fight the foreign wars. These were terrible times. And so let's prepare. Let's understand this is not simply a 4th industrial revolution like the other ones. We'll end up with better, higher quality jobs. This is something else. This is an age of discovery. This is a renaissance moment of huge tumultuous change, and therefore preparing for the future and making sure it's a force for good actually is what we should be doing.
Yeah, thank you, Kate.
Thank you. I agree with everything Ian's just said. I suppose, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on the role of the UK. And I actually do think that we do have a very important role to play. I think we can forge a distinctive voice. I think our research and development is on a par to none. I think that we have the capability of becoming the pioneer around ethical AI. And I think we have huge strengths in law, in research, in our public services. And I think that we are well placed to shape development on a global stage.
I'm going to go back on Ian's thing. The religious wars and the Reformation did not happen because of printing. That's my point, or one of the points. And I completely agree with you that they happen for all sorts of reasons. And it's interesting, printing wouldn't have happened without paper. It's interesting how the changes happen in ways that we don't always understand at the time. That's my point. I think the one thing, I'm just going to defend my little corner of the universe, which is, if we are to try and have a debate about, maximising the virtues and positiveness of technological change, then one thing we are going to need are people, you might call them journalists, who are able to try and inform and stimulate understanding critical approaches, robust conversations about this. And it does worry me that I'm not sure, outside of, well, the tech press is marvelous, but it's so inclusive and inward looking. And the rest of the press, I think, tends to do my kind of killer drone story. So I think there is a sort of understanding gap around this that we all, if we can all do one thing, it's to do, that's why tonight is such a good thing to do, to try and, have this conversation in an open way. And that way, perhaps Kate gets a degree, that degree of accountability.
All right, well, unfortunately, that horrible time of the evening has come, a time to bring everything to a close. So thank you. I mean, first of all, thank you to all of you for coming, of course, and all your amazing questions and comments. Thank you to Christchurch, Oxford and Bolton Capital and for having us here. But I hope finally then, before we all leave, you'll join me in thanking our three amazing panellists for what was, I thought, a really pretty kind of unbelievable discussion, really, and unbelievably wide-ranging, but also specific and at times ferocious or disagreeable. So if you all join me in thanking our three panellists.